Good morning. This is Tristan Alava. This is me filming my issues presentation finally for GSPE 503. Today I will be covering the infantilization of people with disabilities in K through 12 education. So originally I started with just the infantilization of people with disabilities, but we decided to narrow it down to make the final paper a little easier. And we redid it a little bit. I even touched up my citations at the end. But yeah, here is my project. So I want to start by highlighting this term, for their own safety. It's something that comes up constantly throughout the presentation, throughout my research, throughout the papers I've cited. This, it comes in different ways, not just for their own safety, it's for their own good, to help them. But this main idea that we're doing certain things like infantilizing people with disabilities for their own safety. And I think this paper I'm eventually going to write in um, this project is really going to show that this idea of for their own safety is not actually helping them, not helping them at all. It's actually harming them a lot. And we can see that it's harming them in the classroom in a bunch of different ways. One, it's harming them socially, and another way, it's harming them professionally. Now, I use this term professionally as in, you know, kind of looking at school as a job. It's harming their educational journey and keeping them behind. And then for socially, it's treating them as lesser, and how does that affect them socially, and how does that make them different in classroom and cause them to struggle. So that's really the term for their own safety that we're really going to look at and see that how does this idea of for their own safety actually harm them, and how does this harm affect them in grades K through 12, in the classroom. So first, for background, my first study I have comes, it's a Robert Epstein study from 2022, and his associates, right here's the link if you'd like to look further into the study. They published a paper talking about infantilization as a whole, not just for people with disabilities. Does it cover some people with disabilities? Yes, but it covers how does infantilization harm human beings. He covers over 32,000 people from 153 different countries and talks to them and gets data about their accounts of infantilization in their life, and how much it's harmed them and kind of how they feel it's harmed them. So if we go to this study, which I'm not going to do here because I'm on a time limit, but if you go to this study, you can find his actual the math and the equation he used to basically what does this even mean? What does this graph mean? If you go and look at the study, the higher this is, mean percentage of items checked, that means the more it affected them and the more frequently it affected them. And then on the bottom here, it's just in different categories of life. You have things like education, appearance, work, chores, personal habits. All of this is kind of hovering similar, but the one big outlier is emotional abuse. And I think this is a very good term for what infantilization is that this paper kind of gets at, is that yes, it can affect you, but the biggest way it affects you is that this is abuse. This is treating you emotionally abusive ways, just like name calling or other things is abusive. This infantilization, it triggers really the same feelings of abuse that more commonly accepted terms of abuse are. So that's kind of the main idea of this study, and this is for all human beings. So what really happens when people with disability get this emotional abuse that affects everybody? How does that really affect them? So now we have some more historical context. So when I was researching infantilization, it actually surprised me because, spoiler alert for later in the presentation, people today see infantilization, especially with people with disabilities, as like kind of like they're not trying to like be mean to them or harm them. They're doing it for that term from the start for their own good. They If you talk to most sane people, they're gonna say, oh, I have nothing against people with disabilities. They're infantilizing them because they think it's helpful. But in the past, when you really look at how infantilization has been used, infantilization has been not a reaction like we kind of see it now, this unaware reaction where we think it's good. In the past, it's been a tool to actually keep people down. Slaves, women, victim of colonization, all of them faced infantilization to paint them as lesser and keep them from having less rights than, everyone else did. And infantilization was a known tool to keep people in an other group. It's a form of othering that we've been studying. Right here, this is an anti-19th Amendment cartoon, talking about voting for women, literally painting this this girl who might have the right to vote as a baby. They're trying to say she doesn't have the mental capacity, she doesn't understand the issues, she shouldn't be allowed to vote. So I just thought it was fascinating. This is just the example of women, but slaves often faced infantilization, like they're not going to be able to live outside the plantation. So why should we let them go? They're not ready. They're not smart enough. They're too infantilized. Victims of colonization, Europeans came in and they weren't civilized, and they needed proper European help. So that's kind of, it's interesting that infantilization has long not been an unaware reaction for people trying to help, but for a long time has been used to keep people down. So if we know that infantilization is a tool that keeps people down, why do so many disabled people get treated in this way today, and how does that affect them? You know, does it keep them down like it did in the past, or is it a little different when you're not trying to? That's something we can keep looking at. And spoiler alert, it really, if you do two things, and you call it different names, but you're doing the same thing, you really have the same outcome. So as we can see, even though people aren't using it to keep people down anymore, it still really is keeping people down and keeping, people with disabilities especially behind. So now let's specifically look at infantilization for people with disabilities. So Catherine Thornberry and Karen Olson at the University of Alberta in 2005, they published a paper, The Abuse of Individuals with Developmental Disabilities. And I really like this paper because, it doesn't talk about infantilization specifically, it talks about abuse. But as we've learned from our previous studies, infantilization really is a form of abuse. And what is a form of abuse they cover in their paper? It's infantilization. And this is where we actually get the opening term for their own safety, as they talk about this in their paper. So their which I've linked here, it this paper really studies how does abuse affect people with disabilities, and does it affect them at differently than people without disabilities. And from their findings, we see that people with disabilities, they face abuse at much higher rates. And because they're facing abuse at much higher rates, specifically with infantilization, the problems that come with it are much more than normal infantilization, because they're facing it at higher rates and they're getting it all throughout their life, not just in certain areas. So one example of this way of thinking is decision of the parents to have their daughter sterilized to avoid the possibility of pregnancy. And this is a really good example because it kind of relates to what we're going to talk about later. Them treating their daughter infantilized in this situation, they're taking away her abilities down the line, and they're setting her behind her peers by sterilizing her. Maybe in 20 years, if she wants to have a pregnancy at that point, now she's unable to because of the actions that she faced now. And, you know, I think this is a very good paper talking about abuse, because we've seen infantilization is abuse and it sets you up for failure in the future. So why is this important to me? Why did I choose this topic? So quick story time. I won't take forever on it, but when I was a kid, um, me, one of our friends, he lived by a park. So all of us would go to my friend's house and we'd go down to the park and play. And there was a bunch of houses by the park, so other kids would be there, but we kind of had our friend group and we'd go down to the park and play kickball. But one of the kids our age who lived there, near the park, he would come down and play with us. He had a developmental disability. I don't remember what he has because I don't even think we even asked. But, we were just boys who were trying to play kickball, and he was a boy our age that just wanted to come play kickball with us. So, I don't even think we necessarily knew the extent of his disability. We knew he was a little different, but I think we needed a third baseman. So he said, "Hey, want to come play kickball with us?" And over the course of that summer, every time we'd be down there, he'd come down and play kickball or wall ball or whatever with us because we just treated him, as a part of the group. And, that included making fun of him, not in a bullying way, but in a way, you know, 10, 11-year-old boys make fun of each other. If he tripped and fell, we'd help him up, but then make fun of him in the same way I would trip and fall. I would get helped up, but then get made fun of. So we kind of accepted him into our group. And as the summer ended, the school year started, he was in our grade. So we'd see him in classes, and we would treat him the same way in class as we did on the playground. And the issue was, however, now we had, other people there who wanted to infantilize the boy we were playing with. So they saw how we were treating him, and they called us bullies and went to the principal. And we all had to go down to the principal's office and, apologize and say we're sorry. And, some parents were really upset with us, but, luckily, I think all of our parents in the friend group we played with, they were on our side, and we were just like, yeah, we were just playing with him. So, we didn't really get in too much trouble. But the next weekend, we go down, as the weekend comes up, we go back down to my friend's house and go to the park. And sure enough, our friend is down there at the park playing with us. And I'm not telling this story to say, like, oh, me and my friends, we were such great guys at 11. We could be jerks too. But I think this story really highlights infantilization, how, it goes hand in hand with this quote here. Because our principal and some of the students, they didn't know him enough, and they infantilized him by saying, oh, he can't, he's not, we're doing this for his own good, we're keeping him out of, they were taking away his ability to have a group of friends. And I think that's very important to a young boy. And if this went further, because they infantilized him, they would have taken away his ability to have a friend group that he'd go play with. In the same way, in this example, they are taking away the daughter's ability to have a pregnancy later on the line. And that's just a story and experience that has always stuck with me, as I've gotten older. And kind of as I've gotten older, I've realized, this is a special education is a topic I would be willing to explore, because I think it's very important that we don't infantilize people with disabilities for that very reason. All right, next I have another scene that kind of covers infantilization. It's from The Upside. It's not the greatest movie in the world, but it has one very good scene that covers infantilization that I'm going to play real quick, that kind of shows you a different side of infantilization too.
Whoa, shook my hand. You think that's...
I'm skipping
for him? Recession special. Yeah, and for him? Oh, man, don't do that. Talk to him. Sorry. And for you? I want 14 hot dogs and a banana daiquiri. Thanks. And thanks for speaking up. I get treated with such... Or I'm invisible. Unless they know I have money. Welcome to my world. I mean, except the money part.
Alright, so in that movie, um, it's another great example of infantilization. We have Kevin Hart's character and Bryan Cranston's character who's disabled. They're ordering a hot dog, and the cashier asks Kevin Hart, what does he want? In the same way that if a parent is ordering with their little kid, the cashier is going to ask the parent, what does your kid want? Just a clear example of infantilization. He's an adult who can order for himself. And then, after they get the hot dogs, they're standing there and he's like, thank you for speaking up. I'm really invisible to a lot of people. And I play this clip because, it's a clear example of infantilization that leads pretty well into kind of what we see in the classroom. So, another thing I like to bring up with that clip is that when the guy asks Kevin Hart, what does he want? Cranston doesn't make a fuss. He doesn't speak up. He has just accepted it because this is something he faces routinely throughout their life all the time. This idea that he's infantilized and lesser and he's kind of internalized it. So that's another thing that happens with infantilization is that as you're treated as lesser, you start getting this feeling that you're lesser. And that's kind of where it leads to in the classroom. Not only does it take away future opportunities you might have, but it treats you as lesser and makes you not prepared. And has this, like, it's the abuse again. It's emotionally abusive in the way abusive people make you feel like lesser. It's also making you feel like lesser. You're not able to order your own hot dog. So, how does this relate to in the classroom? So, infantilization in the classroom happens, to a lot of students, but like we see with the studies, it happens routinely at higher rates and frequencies with people of disabilities. You know, we see it in really big and small ways. Some topics of infantilization include under-explaining topics or even denial of certain topics like sexual education. And in the past, it was much worse. Acts like the IDEA, they've really helped to make sure children with disabilities are not just being placed in classrooms that are 3 years below where they should be, but rather put in a situation where they're able to learn in different ways, not just given lesser work. But infantilization does still exist in large portions in the classroom today. So, one thing that people with disability often talk about is they feel they have this baby talk that happens to them. And it happens in the classroom too. Baby talk is just when someone, like the comic shows, they kind of speak to you like you're younger than you are, like how you'd speak to a puppy or a baby. That's why it's called baby talk. It comes with a higher tone of voice or, different, vocal tones or, the explanations are like, oh, how does that work? Oh, well, the magic fairy comes in. It's the way you talk to children. And this is very degrading for people with disabilities, like not letting Bryan Cranston's character order a hot dog. It shows that it's that form of othering. It shows that, they're different from their peers. If one of their peers asked their teacher for an explanation, they would just get a teacher student explanation. But when they ask an explanation, they get this baby talk like they're not able to handle it, and it goes back to that for their own good. People and teachers who do this, they're not doing it to keep them down like infantilization was used in the past. They think they're doing it because they're unable to handle a real explanation and they think they're doing it for their own good, but it's really uh, emotionally abusive and harming them and making them feel like lesser. um you know it's just this idea that so many people face it and feel lesser, that is really, it's in the classroom still today and it's talked about, but it's everywhere for people with disabilities. Another thing that happens with people with disabilities, that's infantilization, is under education. So kind of, the IDEA helps a little bit for this, but there are still many different ways that people with disabilities are getting undereducated, even with increased protections for them. So, one example I have is sexual education. Only 3 states require total inclusivity in sexual education. So, that doesn't mean only 3 states require everybody to learn sexual education. That means only 3 states require everybody to learn about sexual education in the same way, whether that's abstinence education or whether that's, sexual education from school. A large majority of our states, 47 of them, they have different rules for how people with disabilities learn about sexual education. And that's just under education. They're not getting the same level of education as their peers in sexual education and even in some other categories. It happens in specific ways of learning too. Something that we see is, for people with disabilities, is this debate of RTI models versus discrepancy models. And, you know, for a long time, people have been arguing about discrepancy models that have been proven to be less effective than RTI models for people with disabilities, just because the way people with disabilities function. They're just different. They're not worse off. They just need different ways of teaching. Like create like kids who have a lot of energy might do better with hands-on teaching. Students with disability might do better with RTI models. And these models have not even been, even with proven research, have been taking their time and being like slowly introduced into specific classrooms, leaving people with disabilities having under education, which is a form of infantilization, because they're doing it, for their own good, but it's really harming them. So finally, it comes back to the original quote from the article about the daughter who gets sterilized. How is infantilization in the classroom also keeping children behind? Um, you know, when children move on to high school and they get to start picking their schedule, or maybe they want to go to college and they want to get into the best college, how does it keep them behind when they've been infantilized their whole life? So I have another story time. It's my last one, I promise. It talks about, I just want to highlight this idea with my time in the military. Um, the military, it's a promotion based system. You do good, you get promoted to the next level. But there's a big known secret in the military. You don't go to mental health. In the past, if you went to mental health, they just kicked you out. If you were feeling depression or needed anything and you went to mental health, they'd give it to you and then kick you out. So you used to not go to mental health if you wanted to keep your job. But now it's a little different. They say you can come to mental health and we won't kick you out. And that's true. But when you go to mental health in the military currently, they take away your ability to do important things, which is deployments and temporary duty locations. These are really important because every year you get a end of year performance review, and on that performance review, if you have a deployment or a temporary duty, you're going to have a much better performance review. So when it comes time for you to promote, which is what the military is all about, if you have those things, you're going to stand out against a peer who doesn't. Therefore, if you go to mental health and are not allowed to even attempt to get those things, you are going to be behind. And when it comes time to promote, they're going to choose your peer over you. Infantilization does this the same way for people with disability as it does in the military. Children who are being undereducated and treated as lesser and not being told they're, the same, they're being told they're other, they're being kept down. They're not being put in the harder physics class, they're put in normal physics, not AP, for their own good, for their own safety, because people assume they can't do it. They're not put in AP US history, they're just put in normal US history. Then when it comes time for them, if they want to move on to college, their resume's worse. They don't have AP classes, they don't have college credits built up that their peers were given who weren't infantilized. So you can see how this infantilization not only does it undereducate you, not only does it give you this feeling of lesser, but it really keeps you behind the whole time you're going through it. So when it's time for you to move on, you're just simply behind. Recommendations. So, what are ways we can fix our internalized infantilization, and what are some ways to share infantilization with other people? So, first, I would say, educate yourself more about people with disabilities and infantilization, and talk and build genuine relationships with people with disabilities. The more you talk to people with disabilities, the more you understand they're just people. Yes, they're people with problems, but I'm also a person with problems. We just have different problems. They may have harder problems in some areas, and I may have harder problems in the other areas, but we're all human beings. And when you look at people like human beings, you're going to look at them like human beings the age they are, not infant human beings like some people look at people with disabilities. And two is to understand biases you may have. Like I said earlier, most people don't look at people with disabilities and say, "Oh, I hate them. I want to keep them down." They genuinely want to help. They want to buy into this idea of we're doing this for their own good. They just don't realize that infantilizing them is hurting them, not helping them. And if you can understand biases you may have in that way, you might realize, hey, something I've been doing that I thought was helpful has really been hurting people with disabilities. And then what are some ways to share with others? So we're in the school of education. We all want to be involved in a classroom of some sort or a school of some sort. Look at programs and materials that your school has and see if you do any of these. Do your programs infantilize people with disabilities, or does it help them in better ways? And most importantly with that, if you see issues in any programs you have, don't just fix it on your own. Work with people with disabilities to see ways to include them equally. Get their input. They're the ones who experience this every day, and you can learn a lot about what has been harmful to them by including them in the process. Most of these infantilization things came because no one talked to a person with disabilities. They just assumed something for their own good. So, in conclusion, infantilization causes problems for all who encounter it, not just people with disabilities. It's an emotionally abusive act. Disabled people face infantilization at much higher rates and prevalencies than people without disabilities, especially during the most important educational developmental moments in their life, K through 12. Not They're facing this emotional abusiveness at higher rates than any other group. And infantilization is still a problem on a in smaller ways like baby talk, and big scales like under education in American classrooms, even with increased knowledge and protections for people with disabilities. Question: after learning more about the problems infantilization causes, I think just ask yourself two things. Can I be more aware of infantilization practices I have or see in the classroom? You know, look back to that clip. If you were the cashier, would you have asked Kevin Hart or would you have asked Bryan Cranston? And if you would have, be honest with yourself, if you would have asked Kevin Hart for Bryan Cranston's order, how can you fix that? Because a lot of it is internalized. People don't want to be rude to people with disabilities. It's just something that they've seen their whole life. So how can you fix that? And I think you can fix that by, most importantly, is just making a deeper connection with a disabled person. Going back to my first story with the kid we played kickball with, I think if the teachers and the girls who had told the principal had a better connection with our um, friend who had a disability, they would have realized that we're not bullying him, we're being friends with him. And I think that is not just in that specific scenario, but in every scenario. If you've never really had a conversation with someone with a disability, and you only see people in disabilities through the lens of our textbooks and what we read and stats that we learn from the internet in our classes, you're not trying to look at them through a lens because most people are good, but you are looking at them through the lens of the book. Go out and just make a deeper connection with a disabled person, and some of those practices you picked up, I promise they will go away because you'll just start seeing them as a person. Here are my references. I'll give you, if you want to pause and relook, I redid them to better be with the Purdue OWL format and APA format. Thank you for learning.